Hi, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, and evening. My name is Prashant Kaddi. I'm a partner with Deloitte in India, and I lead the Deloitte AI Institute in India. We are here to talk about a very important topic, which is with the advent of generative AI, what's the risks and how do we sort of keep the guardrails to ensure that we have trustworthy generative AI? Very interesting panel with me. Joining me are my colleagues, Beena and Bjorn. I'll request them to introduce themselves as well. So we'll have a fun time with a power-packed panel with views across Americas, Europe, and APAC. Over to you, Beena.
Eddie, thank you so much. And I'm excited to speak with all of you today and be engaged in this conversation. My name is Beena Amanat. I lead our global Deloitte AI Institute. I also focus on our work around trustworthy AI and trustworthy generative AI. I think it's a very important topic for us to truly reach the full potential of this powerful technology. Over to you, Bjorn.
Thanks, Beena. My name is Bjorn Bringmann, and as my two colleagues just said, it's an absolute pleasure to be here and discuss on this topic, exchange some notes. I'm working with AI since about 2 decades now, and hence have seen a lot. One thing that has become clear recently, or in the last 10 years, let's say, when this came out of the research labs and went into the public space, is that trust is certainly a crucial part here for adoption, because obviously most people don't trust something new, or don't take something new if they can't trust it. So a very important topic. Happy to be part of this conversation, and let's kick it off.
Thanks, Beena, Bjorn. So I think fundamentally the AI Institute and we all globally under Beena's leadership are trying to bring together research, academia, consulting practitioners, and industry on a common platform. So to look at how we together shape the advance of this technology and get our arms around it collectively. With generative AI, obviously, I mean, as Bjorn mentioned, for decades now, practitioners have been looking at how this becomes mainstream, and generative AI has done what perhaps we've all been trying for a long time, which is bring AI to the boardrooms, to the parties, and to the living rooms, right? So without further ado, one of the key issues that, and has been talked about globally and across social media, etc., is the whole issue of hallucination, right? So maybe first, Beena, given you've written the book on trustworthy AI, what do you look at, hallucination, maybe for our viewers, what hallucination is, and then what the risks are and how we can sort of try and mitigate them.
Yeah, I think it's funny how we tweak some of this terminology. And I know, Bjorn, you and Kaddi are both technologists. So, it's we might call it hallucination, but it's a reliability issue, right? If your software, if the technology is not consistently delivering reliable information, it's a reliability issue. You can call it hallucination, imaginary information, but as engineers, we know it is a reliability issue. If your calculator doesn't show you accurate results, right, then you don't call it hallucination. You call it, the calculator is not working. It's a reliability issue. Or if your maps doesn't show you the correct pathway, right? It's really a reliability issue, and that's the way to think about it so that you can then solve for it. We've always been able to solve for software reliability issue. The key factor, I would say, just like with AI in general, right? It is important to look at it from the context and the use case. In some cases, there is a higher level of tolerance for hallucination or not having that that level of reliability. For example, maps, right? If it doesn't accurately show you the most optimal path if you want it, it's fine. But if you're using generative AI for, say, patient diagnosis, or where you need those high level of accuracy and reliability, then absolutely you probably don't want to use. So I think translating it into a terminology that can be solved for is the first step to address that risk. And calling it hallucination makes it easier to understand and relate to, but as technologists, we do know it's a reliability issue, and then we can track and solve for it. You asked, some of the ways it can be actually solved for. One is absolutely making sure providing the human feedback, right? AI thrives on human feedback. AI works best when it is teamed up with humans. And this is one of those issues where human feedback is going to be highly crucial. The next is, having high quality training data, right? Making sure the input data is well bound and within, with a high quality makes it easier to prevent some of these issues around reliability. And there are several such, providing continuous quality control, providing continuous feedback into the algorithm actually will help address the reliability issue. I do believe that while generative AI hallucinations are, a really, frustrating hurdle, I think framing it as a reliability issue can help us solve for it and adopt some of the best practices that we've learned from prior experiences.
I guess I couldn't agree more with what you said. I think there's one point I'd like to add. So when we say hallucination, and you just said that might not be the correct term, it sounds almost as if there is a decision happening in the background, that it's kind of almost proactively hallucinating, or that it could know that it's hallucinating. However, it's at the end of the day, it's just putting out the next word, which looks plausible in the way a human would have written it, and hence when it comes up with plausible text that just doesn't happen to be a fact or true, then we call it hallucination. But the system has just done what it was trained to do, namely writing a plausible text, if you speak of language models. So I think understanding this part, that these models as they are right now are language models, in case of language models, obviously, enhance good with the language, but not necessarily, let's say, knowledge or thinking models, right? That is also a first step in understanding what they can and cannot do and how they should be, let's say, packaged. I mean, we've seen many cases, right, where that hit the news, be it a little briefcase in the US, or a politician in Australia, where the systems existing just produced, well, fake news, so to speak, with pretty big fallout.
Yeah. And Bjorn, I think I know we are going to cover a lot of risk today that we will talk through, but the biggest risk really is to not use Gen AI, right? This is such a powerful capability. So I want to turn the question back to Kadit, to you and to Bjorn. What are some of the generative AI capabilities and applications emerging in the enterprise landscape in businesses that you work with? What trends are you observing? Are businesses fully on board with Gen AI? What's the state of the market today that you are observing? Maybe Kaddi, you can start.
Thanks, Veena. No, indeed, and I think just on the previous topic, it's important to just realize what generative AI is and what it is not, right? So because of the human-like interaction, we tend to attribute an intelligence to the models, and I think that's absolutely not what it is, right? So though AI does have the word intelligence in it, it's not living intelligence that we're having a conversation with. In terms of enterprises, I think we've been having a very large number of conversations across sectors. There is a lot of curiosity, and I think at a senior management level, the idea is, with this new technology, how do we get our arms around it, and what impact does it have for an industry, which could be in some cases catastrophic in terms of the way they do business currently. So how do they ride this wave rather than go under it, right? So I think that's the chief sentiment. But obviously, people are looking at how they can change business models, ways of working, and sort of get to sort of the next version of the industry that they are in. In terms of use cases, broadly, I would summarize it under 4 buckets that we've seen a lot of acceptance, traction, that companies are already willing to start using it, right? So one is, in a very broad sense, searching or summarizing text from large documents, right? So, and maybe I'll give a couple of examples in each as we go along, right? So, for instance, there is a pharma company that is looking at impacted by FDA information that comes out every day on specific molecules, etc. There is a manufacturing company which is looking at when their engineer is standing on a platform and has to look through a 10,000-page manual, how does one do it without necessarily, sort of literally climbing down from it, and so on and so forth, right? And get meaningful answers. The second, so that's the first large bucket. The second bucket is content creation, right? Fundamentally, creating images, video, marketing content, etc. One very interesting use case and a client that we are serving today in India is a jeweler who is looking at an ability to actually prompt an interface to produce designs for them, right? So a customer is looking for, let's say, there's a diamond solitaire, but the customer wants a purple colored solitaire ring. So the system designs a few options and gives it to the product team for feasibility check and to the customer to choose what they like. Obviously, that customer journey has to be managed in order that false expectations are not set, but it's actually design generation. It's a live use case that we're actually working on. The third broad bucket is the software development lifecycle, which is around code generation, around intelligent test data generation, etc. Right? So a lot of software failures do occur because they've not been tested against the right data, and we're seeing some very promising results in some of the work that we're doing in this space. Right? Our code generation, of course, is a well-known use case that we're all working on across the board as practitioners. And last but not least is the interaction that customers have with brands and companies, primarily around chatbots, some very interesting conversational bots which involve merging data which is internal to a company or an enterprise and external all over the web, right? So let's say looking at documents in text, summarizing it or searching it, having meaningful ways to look at parts of it, content creation, generating images, videos, the software lifecycle, and the whole conversational bots, right? So these are the four broad areas where we're seeing broad acceptance. There are specific use cases in life sciences, in media, in others where which are very specific, but this is what we're seeing in the market out here, Veena.
Bjorn, what about you?
Same here. Yeah, indeed. So the semantic search, right? That's a certainly very frequent one, and also one that's easily understood. And if the data is there, also reasonably easy to implement. Similar, obviously, for content generation and the code development pieces, right? And for code, we have certainly seen some companies hesitating more than others. So the delta, so to speak, is bigger than in others of these cases. I think for code generation, as Kali already mentioned, there are different parts in this whole software development process where these tools can be used, right? And in some cases, they're better suited than in others. But we can also see that it's picking up speed, and also we're using it internally here and there, right? Not everywhere, obviously, needs to be checked if suitable, but testing, experimenting with it. One case, or let's say one thing in general that we observe a lot, and to be honest, also recommend, is that certainly for the first POV or the first case to be tested, or maybe also the second and the third one, is to rather aim at an internal audience. Right? So you don't necessarily want to have your semantic search available to the public, because if something goes wrong, you immediately have, the general public that's kind of suffering from this failure. Whereas if you face it internally, you basically have the same technical setup, but it's obviously a lot easier in terms of testing and learning with it and going step by step, and then going with an external use case once you're sure how to control these things. Now, one case that Kadi didn't mention that we see here kind of flying under the radar, but I think it's worth mentioning is has this unfortunate technical name of entity extraction. But simply said is lots of, I mean, maybe it's a German case, to be honest, right? There are lots of paper pieces that may be scanned in as a PDF then or something, but there's a lot of stuff happening on paper, and there's not necessarily a standard in terms of how the forms typically are filled out on paper. So it's kind of free text, more or less. Still, there are typically like 5 facts in there, like let's say a date or some ID number or something else, like a counterparty in banking statements and so on, that need to be extracted by the recipient and put into a very simple format, right? Where you just have these four elements. And usually this is done by humans, which is very cumbersome. And this is a very nice case also for these language models, because they can process the text, the free text, and can kind of easily identify these pieces and kind of copy them in, simply speaking, some kind of database. And the human, in the worst case, so to speak, only needs to double check if what was copied is actually the correct stuff. And this is a case, as I said, it's a bit under the radar. But certainly in Germany, and I can imagine many other places have this as well, quite an interesting one and kind of often overlooked because it's not one of the classic ones, so to speak.
No, I mean, absolutely. I think the applications are numerous. I think it's we are slowly scratching deeper and deeper, and I think in the drug cycle of invent or launching a new molecule, in the process of generating a new TV show, etc. So the gains are immense that we're talking about in live conversations to clients. But having said that, Bina, so I think countries are sort of really thinking hard about regulations. Beyond EU is always usually the first of the block, for any regulation. And I think US is having a number of conversations as well, a number of things in APAC. So maybe Bjorn, start with you, right? So I think where are we on regulation, and what's your sort of perspective on it?
Yeah, indeed, leading in regulation. You never know if it's good or a bad thing, right? Heavily discussed, certainly. And here it's one of the EU AI Act obviously is one of the, well, not one, but the main topic in this case, extremely visible here. It would be really curious to hear from you guys, how visible this is in APAC, the US, and so on. But it has progressed quite far, right? So about 6 weeks ago, it was basically adopted in the parliament and is now being discussed with the countries to actually put it into a final form of law. The expectation is a bit that this is going to be finalized end of this year. There are often delays, but that's at least kind of an expectation at the moment. Even if it would be finalized end of this year, it's still going to take a while until it takes effect. So I believe it's not going to take effect before 2026. Obviously, it will take effect at some point in the near future. So companies should have that in mind and not kind of play free of this in the 2 years that remain. So that's certainly happening here. And I think the main discussed pieces there it's a 4-level risk classification, if you like, right? So basically any kind of AI case, and there's a definition of what AI is in there. Any kind of AI case is classified in one of the 4 levels, which starts basically at the how's it called, actually, unacceptable risk. So those are cases like crowd control, if you like, right? So you're not allowed to identify people out in the streets and track them, right? Or these kind of things are simply unacceptable and hence cannot be implemented, at least not here in the EU. Then there are certain cases of high risk. There can understand if it comes into parts which could be life-threatening but would be useful if they work. For example, then that's something that would usually fall in the high-risk category. Then there are others which go limited risk. I mean, think about banking and so on. So they're all kind of distributed over the spectrum. And at the end, obviously, there are some cases where there's just no risk, right? Now, luckily, we have a whole team of experts here that can give all the details on this one because it tends to be a complex piece that's moving at quite some speed. But in the low risk category, for example, something like a regular advertisement. If that goes wrong, nobody got hurt, right? In the very worst case, you've spent microcents on the wrong advertisement. So there's a good reason for all of these 4 cases. Going to be very interesting to see once the law actually exists, how this is going to be implemented. So that's what we certainly have here. And yeah, a bunch of people working on this and being very close. And obviously it's happening in every conversation we have with clients, next to other legal questions that are out there. So it's not the only one.
Yeah, and
how's that?
One of the effects of the rapid advancement and widespread availability of Gen AI applications, right? It has supercharged interest in AI policy and regulation. Here lawmakers are holding hearings, hosting briefings, getting input from experts to help them better understand the effects of AI on national security, on the economy, workforce, and population. So several bills have been introduced in the US Congress and state legislatures. Multiple stakeholders are involved in these AI policy discussion. But at a high level, I'm seeing it under 5 buckets, so to speak. One is, the first one is around misuse. How can regulators protect society from the misuse of AI? What is the balance there, right, between protecting rights and protecting from misuse? The second is obviously around national security. How can AI be used to enable national security? How could it be used to enhance adversary capabilities and threaten our national security? The fourth is the impact on workforce. How can we reap the most workforce benefits of AI while addressing issues such as education and workforce displacement? The fourth one is really around bias and discrimination, because as we know, generative AI can, aggravate and create more biases and discrimination. So how can bias and discrimination be identified and mitigated to ensure equitable outcomes for AI-enabled decisions? The fifth one is really around governance. How should AI be governed to best advance the country's goals of innovation, technology leadership, and individual and societal protection? So there's a lot of thought and inputs being captured into creating these AI policies and regulations. So I'm personally very, very excited to see the progress we are making on this topic. But Kadi, would love to hear what you're seeing in APAC.
So in APAC, fundamentally, I think, for example, in India, we are looking at personal data protection, which came into parliament, which was sort of almost became law. And then, the government actually withdrew, saying they're coming with another version. And now there's a new version, which is under discussion. So I think chiefly a lot has been focused around that. And I see that in a number of other countries, these laws which govern, primarily personal information, and secondly, any breaches, right? I think, whether it's, Southeast Asia, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, etc. That's been the primary focus, right? Another important area where, specifically, North Asia or East Asia has sort of taken the lead, China and a few other countries, is to sort of look at content which shapes public opinion or which can be construed as, contrary to interests which are national in nature. So there is a law that has come in where one is required to share what training data has been given to any model at any time, and there's a whole bunch of things that are being monitored. But I think most of Asia is quite far away from it. The focus still continues to be personal data protection and personal information protection, and its therefore implications on and ethical AI in general has garnered interest in several geographies. Some are in various stages of lawmaking. Specifically on generative AI, I think APAC is a little bit farther away, sort of from putting out something, and I think perhaps as they are wont to, they will wait for EU and perhaps the US to take and set some of the guardrails and watch carefully before they leap in, and how they can look at customize it. Companies, however, are preparing to look at how they can exploit this technology for business, for use cases, for a bunch of areas across the entire value chain, right? Uh, Supply chain is looking at it separately, sales and marketing is looking at it separately, finance is looking at it separately, etc. As in, they're all looking at separate use cases which add value. And I think the regulations are going to be sort of a process of adaptation rather than wait and watch to see laws, etc., before one embarks on this journey, right? So I think that's essentially where APAC is at the moment, right?
That's great.
So given where we are, there are generative AI applications. There are a bunch of security, privacy, and of course legal issues, provenance issues, copyright, IP issues, etc. Right. So I think how is from an enterprise perspective, how can they look at their own data and IP and make sure? So what are you seeing in clients? And their mood or guardrails that they're trying to set.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, right? And certainly there is no one size fits all here. There are some companies, at least speaking from the clients that I talk to, that say, it's unclear at the moment. So there are quite some questions which are undecided, right? And they say, hey, let's risk it, right? So they have a certain risk appetite, and others that have a lot lower risk appetite that have an interesting case, but at the end of the day say like, there's a risk, might be small, but if it happens, it's actually going to hurt real bad. So and then decide not to go. Like the ones that the cases, and I think there are two things coming together. The cases where companies decide not to try are typically ones that would garner a lot of attention, right? And hence are obviously immediately kind of coming with a bunch of red flags for the authorities to kind of pick up on, right? Whereas cases which, kind of happen internally in let's say, not clearly decided field, it's it's happening behind closed curtains, if you like, right? So there's time to learn. It's not clear if it's okay, or if there might be issues coming up. But at the moment, what I think we can see is that there are a few companies that actually stand still and say, let's wait till everything is crystal clear. But most actually say, okay, we may not want to do big external cases that garner a lot of attention, which could actually kind of come back at us because there could be things which are not clear yet, but might turn out to be negative. But certainly, if we do internal things, we can learn. And once it has become clear, we're ready to flip the switch and basically take them outside or turn them off, whatever way it goes. And I think that's a quite healthy attitude.
Yeah. So Bjorn, to add to that, so Gen AI of course has this, amplifies, aggravates, similar safety, security, and privacy issues that have existed with traditional AI, right? So say, for example, on privacy, Gen AI requires large amounts of training data, really making us questions about where the data comes from. What's the data provenance? Is there sensitive personal data? Is there proprietary data? We are seeing already challenges around copyrighted material. So where the data comes from, how to protect it, and how to ensure it is not biased, right? So as with other types of AI, what we're seeing where the best thing is to do is for organizations or companies to develop cohesive processes for managing the privacy of all stakeholders involved, including the data providers, the vendors, end customers, employees. I think it is, it's just highlighting one of the issues which has already existed with AI, right? To make sure that we are addressing it in a proactive way. And, there are different ways to, address it. Some might be around removing personal data, using synthetic data, or even preventing end users from inputting personal data into the system, right? So I think there are several ways to address it. From a safety and security perspective, generative AI is obviously prone to new and also unknown attacks, also to known attacks. So thinking proactively about what kind of vulnerabilities Gen AI opens into your existing systems is something companies are addressing proactively and have to be front and center as you adopt these technologies, especially in high risk use cases.
Indeed, and so I mean, some of these privacy preserving techniques, model audit, so to say, or looking at bias on an ongoing basis, some adversarial defense mechanisms to ensure that there are no attacks, and misuse of models. Absolutely, a bunch of these are and controlling access, but also maybe and we go back to first principles on the whole trustworthy AI framework, right? So where we look back at fairness, transparency, reliability, and explainability, right? Some of these core topics, which are as much, if not more, necessary for given generative AI is here, as much as it is true for AI overall, right? So any specific sort of experiences or the trends that you're seeing on these, going back to trustworthy principles, Bina, from your perspective, that has really helped?
I think the key message that we're trying to say is Gen AI accelerates and amplifies all the risks that have always come with AI, right? The principles of the fundamental trustworthy AI aspects still are very relevant. It's just opening out additional nuances. So thinking proactively and addressing those risks from a use case perspective is crucial. I think the traditional trustworthy AI principles, whether it's being fair and impartial, robust and reliable, transparent and explainable, safe and secure, accountable and responsible, and respectful of privacy. These domains of trust also map onto the risks and limitations inherent in Gen AI systems. So, I'll double click a little bit on the bias and fairness aspect, right? Limiting bias in AI outputs is a priority for all models of any kind, and specific, whether machine learning or generative, but the level of bias tolerance also depends on the use case. So it is right from looking at your training and testing data and making sure it's representative, it is diverse, that still holds true. In a generative AI enabled chat bot, think of it that something that produces culturally specific language for an audience in one region, but may not provide that same level of nuance for another language and another region, right? That leads to an application that simply performs better for one group. So, that's the nuance of fairness and bias you need to consider when you bring in generative AI into the picture. So thinking through who's your end audience, what's the kind of, are you leaving any of your stakeholders behind by using this new technology? So, I think it is very important to stay true to first principles to start with, and then, think through those nuances.
And I guess if we look at explainability and transparency, there are similar things at play here. For me, it's with transparency and also explainability, the easy thing is really, why would anyone trust a new technology if it's not clear what's happening inside, right? Which is exactly what explainability and transparency are tackling. So making, transparent what's going on, and hence fostering trust in the technology. Now, once that trust is established, we could probably kind of go a little bit further where transparency becomes more complicated or explainability is more tricky, right? But certainly for starters, this is a key piece. And obviously also if these systems are used in any kind of context where there has to be a clear way to explain what's going on, right? This is not going to go away. But there might be other cases where explainability is just relevant at the beginning for people to kind of understand that how the systems roughly work. And then later on, you might be fine with the trust, so to speak, right? What I think is interesting and is a good example here is less text models, but actually image models. There are also a lot of image models that actually, well, you can't say read an image, but look at an image and interpret what's on there. And there are many examples from the past, where basically the key decision factor for what's been recognized on the image was not the actual object, but the landscape around it, right? So which doesn't help. Like wolves and dogs, I believe, was such an example, where dogs tend to be photographed in gardens and wolves tend to be photographed, probably in a winterish outside environment. And it's a lot easier to identify the environment than to find the wolf or the dog on the picture. Now, the model that you get is not the model that you wanted. Similar with Gen AI, if we look at images and say we want to read signs in an image or identify a number for something, right? There are models that can show very nicely which part of the image is actually contributing to the answer, and maybe also in a negative way say which part is certainly not contributing, right? So which parts are kind of actively ignored, and others which are really considered or focused on to generate the answer. And just looking at this can help a long way in terms of understanding if the model is doing what you want it to do, or if it's doing something else that by chance works in this one or two cases. So, if it comes to reading numbers and it marks up the number, that's relevant information for, well, identifying the number in the picture, that sounds good. If it's marking up some complete different space, but still produces the right number, well, there's probably something going on you want to fix, right? So this, in terms of explainability and transparency, very practical, has a lot more behind it, but I think it really helps fostering trust for sure. But there's more, right, Kadi?
Absolutely, and very interestingly on a couple of things. I think the whole aspect of accountability and transparency is very critical, because when one uses a model to be absolutely to take accountability for its outcomes, automatically brings in trust into the entity which is sort of serving that as well, right? And very interestingly, language models in India, we're trying to do, as you might be aware, we have a lot of languages out here in India. There's a project called Bhashini, which is trying to sort of enable large access to internet and to applications through local languages. And local languages, just for those who may not be aware, so there are 22 scheduled languages in our constitution and about 150 commonly used dialects, which are fairly different from each other, right? And there are a few thousand dialects which are actually of different flavors, right? So it's a massive problem. So maybe let's like all sort of good conversations, maybe we should do a sort of a rapid fire point, right? So maybe right. So what can companies do today, and what should they do? So maybe two things that companies should do, Bina.
So number one is make sure all your stakeholders are AI literate. That includes your employees, your vendors, your ecosystem. Make sure that they have the basic understanding of how AI works and what are some of the ways that, the risks that come with it, so that you can proactively address it. That's number one. Number two, make sure you have the right controls and governance in place to catch some of these issues early on, just like you would have for any software system. That's it from me.
Yeah, let me just pick the other two, so to speak. I'd say don't go alone, right? I mean, this is fast moving, and there's hardly any enterprise or company that has all the skills to kind of keep up with the speed of this. So work with the ecosystem, work with startups, or as a startup, work with incumbents, or work with partners that have done this before in many places. They might have a better overview. There are vendors out there that have the technical abilities that are hard to dive into if you haven't built it over the last 3 years. So bottom line, don't go alone. And we have active interest. So clients are asking us if they can, share some notes. The other one, I believe, is quite simple. Start. Like waiting is not really an option, because while there are certain risks, as mentioned before, the risk that's often kind of overlooked is the risk of basically not doing anything. And then, well, as you know, the market will basically catch you. That might not be the position you want to be in either. So rather move forward carefully than standing still.
Perfect. And from my own experience that I see, and what we are trying to do as well. Number one, try and do something rather than just read about it, because that gives you the experience, the know-how of what it takes to actually get the right, or as we call in our terms, show, not tell, right? Number one. And number two, I think maybe the level of rigor that we use for testing, validation, the data that goes in, and the outputs. Significantly more rigor in making sure, and also ensuring that the output is taken for what it is, right? And maybe that's an extension to what you mentioned, Beena. So, for example, if we do a search and we get 1 to 1,000 search results, all right, or any search, we know that there are 1,000 searches and none of them is 100% accurate, right? Similarly, but if we get an answer from a prompt, the only challenge is it's just one answer, and there is more belief that it is closer to being accurate, right? Which doesn't need to be. So I think just sort of taking it for what it is perhaps, and maybe that was number three, but I think those are the things that I think, apart from, of course, what you all said. So I think that was a very interesting conversation. I think, we could go on, but any other quick sort of closing remarks, Beena, Bjorn, that you want to leave with the audience?
I think if I have to leave with something, it'll be like, we've talked a lot about risks today. There are, risks that come with using any new technology, but the biggest risk is not using it. So, get started, use it. And this was a great conversation. Thank you so much for having me on this panel, Kadi.
Bjorn, any quick?
Yeah, I think last words, so to speak, it's not going to go away, right? There's certainly a lot of attention on it right now, may fade a little bit at some point, but there's no sign of this piece of technology that it's going to go away again. So as Beena said, not starting, right, is a bad choice, because you're going to be the only one that didn't start. Not a great place to be in. And indeed, thanks a ton for having me on this one. Was a pleasure to talk to you too.
Likewise, thanks so much for. Likewise, it was fantastic sort of to be here. Fantastic conversation. I think absolutely echo the thoughts here. What we should be looking at is how to ride the wave. I think there's the capabilities and potential is immense. It has the ability, as your background suggests, Bjorn, that this does change potentially everything. On that note, thanks so much, and till later.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.